Okay, I've mounted our crank in the machine. Just there's a little device I use to get the rod throws kind of close. We'll indicate them in. As you can see, the crank is revolving around 1 and 4 journal, and that's accomplished by just moving the chucks. See, the chucks are on slides, and I've just cranked the chucks both sides, headstock and tailstock, the same amount, to achieve that. Now, of course, all that weight off center creates a problem, but in here, there are 2 big lead weights in there that are on screws that you can screw in back and forth to offset the weight of what you created by putting a crank in there on the rod throws. Now, this machine, the modern machines, can measure the offset exactly. And this is accomplished with a dial indicator on both the head and the tailstock. Of course, this stroke on a B is 3.5. As you can see by the dial here, that is 3.5 inch, and the same goes for this side, 3.5. So now what I've done is set the machine at the stroke the crank is supposed to have. Now we will check it to see what it actually has. If it's typical British crank, it'll be fairly close, but not perfect. Now you have to adjust 2 things. The rod throw can be out of index, and it can also be off on the stroke. Well, we're going to correct the index, and what I mean by the indexing is not the journal in relation to how far away it is from the main to get the stroke. It's side to side, let's say. I'm going to, okay, 0. I've got an indicator on the journal here. I'm going to 0 my gauge and then revolve the crank 180 from that position to see where we are. Okay, it's off 13 thou. Now that little bit that's off, that's just because I used a real rough gauge to get it close when I mounted the crank in the chucks. Okay, we'll check it again. Set the gauge to 0. Rotate, take the crank around. Okay, we're at 1 thou, so we'll trim it just a little more. This machine has trim feature, so that on both the chuck and the tailstock, that I can actually, this knob right here, I can move the chucks just a very, very tiny amount. It's just like the trim on an airplane. If you want to adjust your trim just a little bit, little fine feed knob. Okay, now this should be within a 1/2 thou here. I'm rotating the crank. Okay, right back to 0. Now I'm going to check the stroke. You can see the crank is in the, like on the top of the journal in the stroke, and we're going to set to 0. Rotate the crank around. Now what do we have? We have like -1. So that figure is comparing the machine versus the crank. So in effect, the crank has got 3-inch 501,000 stroke, 1 thou more than what the machine is set at. Now I'm going to do the same thing for number 4 throw. Check the indexing. I'm going to check it compared to number 1. It should be perfect. It's within 2 thou. Incredibly close. Very, very good for a stock crank. Now the stroke is coming up -2. So these strokes are extremely close. 1 and 4 practically, for all intents and purposes, dead on. Now I'm going to rotate the crank. Now another feature of this machine is it has indexing chucks. In other words, when I rotate this chuck, you're going to hear some clicking. There are detents built into the chuck that allow you to rotate exactly 90 degrees or 120 degrees for a 6-cylinder. So now these 2 rod throws are exactly 180 degrees apart from the first 2. So if you index grind a crankshaft, that's what they mean. You're starting at number 1 and then going exactly 180 degrees for the next set of journals. Okay, let's see where we are. We'll check the indexing and see how close this crank is. Okay, set the gauge to 0. Rotate it up. Pretty darn close, 5 thousandths. That's extremely close. I give this crank some credit. Now we'll check the stroke. Oop. Again, set the gauge to 0. Rotate the crank. What do we have? Ooh, almost minus 8. Which means these two throws have got, well, I'm assuming this one is the same, plus 8 stroke. So there's a 6 thou difference in the stroke between the two journals. Not unusual. This is why I check every crank. So we have plus 2 stroke on number 1 and 4, average. We had 1 and 2, we'll call it 2, and plus 8 on these two journals. So what I'm going to do is actually average those 2 strokes so that I can grind all 4 strokes the same. So I'm going to set the stroke of the machine at 3" 505, and that'll split the difference in the strokes, and so that they'll be equal. So this crank will have a little extra stroke. So that's what you have to go through on every crank when you set one up, if you want them all the same. As far as indexing and stroke. Now, if the indexing wasn't so close that I couldn't correct it, I would have to move the indexing a little bit. That's just normal for cranks. But this crank is actually, with the exception of the strokes. Now, one thing that can cause strokes to be different from these throws to these throws is if the crank is bent. However, I've checked this crank for straight. It's perfectly straight, so that was just ground with a little extra stroke on those two center journals. But when I get done, they'll all have the same stroke, and it'll be good to go. Now, my next video, I'll actually start the machine up and grind this crank so you can see it in action.